This is an MJA Inc. Investigations warning. This MJA podcast is rated E for explicit. Some details of a case and language used on this podcast might be upsetting to some of our listeners. Listeners' discretion is advised. And for those who are still with us, kick back and enjoy the show. When there is an ending, there was a beginning. Every victim has a picture to paint. Every true crime has its time and place. Please join our MJ podcast, the series Deep into the Woods, Missing Persons, Unsolved Crimes, and the Does. Welcome to our MJ podcast. This series, Deep into the Woods, Missing Persons, Unsolved Crimes, and the Does. This is episode 18, part 3, An Unsolved Abduction and Murder. My name is Mark, and I will be your host for tonight's show. And joining me later will be our colorful co-host, Miss Callie. We are coming to you from our Northeast Kingdom office located in Plattsburgh, New York. Welcome to Anaheim, California. The 1980 unsolved abduction and murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. For all unsolved cases, you need to bring the light into the darkness. Let's talk about stalking and abduction and murder. The 32-year-old single mother, Dorothy Jane Scott, and her 4-year-old son lived with her aunt in Stanton, California. The 32-year-old Scott was working as a back office secretary for Swingers Psych Shop, once owned by her father, and Custom John's Head Shop. The two businesses were side by side on 517 South Brookhurst Street in Anaheim, California. Dorothy's parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, often babysitted their grandson. Dorothy tirelessly worked to provide for her son, considering her son's father is a deadbeat dad and is absent from his life, and the father lives in Missouri. Dorothy Jane Scott's friends, family, and colleagues claims Dorothy was a very religious and compassionate woman who didn't have any animosity towards anyone. The 32-year-old Scott preferred to stay indoors and attend church rather than taking part in outside influences or attending social gatherings. Dorothy Jane Scott would date men on occasion, but most of her focus was directed towards her son. The 32-year-old Dorothy Scott treated other people with generosity and in all sense of purposes, not giving anyone a reason to dislike her. But an unknown man who was a monster hiding in plain sight took an unhealthy fondness for Dorothy Scott that altered her life in such a drastic and deadly fashion that remains unexplained to this day. The deadly nightmare all began in the early months of 1980, when 32-year-old Dorothy Jane Scott started receiving anonymous phone calls on a regular basis for months at her place of employment and at her residence she shared with her aunt. The unidentified mail caller would often claim his love for her. Then a complete 360 on other calls, the unidentified mail caller would unleash his heated malice intent by threatening to murder Dorothy Scott. The unknown caller admitted to Dorothy Scott he was stalking her and proved those claims by providing details regarding the clothing she had on. He would go into great detail about Scott's day-to-day activities at certain times throughout the day. There was one call that really haunted Dorothy. In a deep, hostile, and threatening voice, the unknown caller told her he would get her alone, all to himself, and dismember her body into bits and pieces while she was still alive. The 32-year-old Scott alerted her parents and even mentioned she recognized the voice but couldn't recall the name. The alarming phone calls and violent threats continued, and so in May 1980, Dorothy Scott signed up for karate classes and was considering buying a firearm. On May 28, 1980, Dorothy Scott went to work early to attend an employee meeting. Dorothy felt safer after taking the self-defense courses, but still felt unnerved while in a public setting. At the employee conference with Scott and others were Pam Head and Conrad Bostron. During the meeting, Dorothy Scott noticed Conrad Bostron wasn't looking very well, and he had a red rash on his forearm. Out of concern for his well-being, Dorothy Scott and Pam Head took Bostron to the UC Irvine Medical Center. The emergency room visit would see the entire day and night disappear as Scott and Head remained in the waiting room for their co-worker's discharge. At around 11 p.m., Conrad was released from the hospital with his prescription in hand to treat a black widow spider bite. Dorothy Scott went to the restroom while Pam waited with Conrad, and this was the only time the two women were separated from one another throughout the whole day. Dorothy Scott went to get her car while Pam Head and Conrad Bostron went to the drugstore a few feet away from the hospital to get Conrad's prescription. The 32-year-old Scott drove a white 1973 Toyota station wagon. Pam Head and Conrad Bostron were in the drugstore for 5 minutes, and they assumed Scott would be waiting directly outside for them. But the 32-year-old Dorothy Scott wasn't there. The two started to walk where Scott had originally parked her vehicle. All of a sudden, they were confronted by Scott's vehicle driving at a high rate of speed in their direction with the headlights on full beam. The headlights partially blinded them as they waved their arms in the air to get Scott's attention. The driver of Scott's white 1973 Toyota station wagon never stopped as the vehicle swerved past them erratically and made a sharp right turn out of the parking lot. Even though Head and Bostrom thought it was an odd situation, they remained at the hospital believing Scott would return to pick them up and explain her behavior. After waiting for almost 2 hours, Pam Head called Dorothy Scott's parents and asked if they had had any contact with Dorothy. The parents had stated no. That's when they notified the police and reported 32-year-old Dorothy Scott as missing. Let's take a pause for the cause, and we will be back in a moment to continue the unsolved abduction and murder of Dorothy James Scott. Be back in a moment. Welcome back to our MJ podcast, the series Deep into the Woods, Missing Persons, Unsolved Crimes, and the Does. This is episode 18, part 3, Unsolved Abduction and Murder. Welcome to Anaheim, California. The 1980 unsolved abduction and murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. Right before 5 a.m. on the morning of May 29, 1980, Dorothy Scott's white Toyota station wagon was discovered in flames in a back of an alleyway 10 miles from the hospital. But the 32-year-old white female, Dorothy Scott, was nowhere in sight. Several search parties were conducted in the following days for the 32-year-old Scott, but their efforts produced and turned up nothing. Vera and Jacob Scott feared the worst when Vera received a phone call from an unidentified male saying he had murdered her daughter. The police was immediately called regarding the disturbing phone call. Law enforcement told the Scott family not to release any details about their daughter's disappearance or the phone call to the media. This was in order to have an upper hand with hidden information, and that would steer them clear of any false confessions. After a week had gone by without any positive results, Jacob and Vera Scott's hope in the police faded. Dorothy Scott's parents decided to report the story of their daughter's disappearance to the local newspaper, the Santa Ana Register. In the story, a reward was offered in the amount of $2,500 to anyone who would provide information leading to Dorothy Scott's whereabouts, dead or alive. Now, with Dorothy Scott's disappearance in the eyes of the public, on June 12, 1980, Pat Riley, the editorial manager of the Santa Ana Register, received a nameless phone call. The unidentified caller said to Riley, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The unknown male caller went on to give intimate details about the night of Dorothy Scott vanishing that wasn't released to the public. The unidentified caller knew about Conrad Bostron's spider bite and the red scarf Dorothy had worn. Even more chilling, the unknown caller stated Dorothy had called him from the hospital hours before she disappeared. The anonymous caller had details about what transpired, but police were under the impression Dorothy never placed a phone call to any individual. This was due to the fact that Pam Head was by Scott's side the entire day, other than going to the restroom and going to the parking lot to get her vehicle. Remember, Vern Scott received her first call by the unknown male caller 1 week after her daughter, Dorothy Scott, disappeared. The monster hiding in plain sight went on to call Dorothy Scott's mother, Vera Scott, every Wednesday. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, Dorothy Scott hasn't been found, and the harassing phone calls never stopped. The phone calls lasted 4 years, even though the police installed a voice recorder to Vera Scott's phone line with the hope of tracing these calls. But they were unable to pinpoint a location because the conversations were so brief. The unknown caller was just a total monster. On some days, he would ask if Vera was related to Dorothy, and when she replied yes, he would state, "I got her," and he would hang up the phone. Then on other days, the unknown caller would confess he had killed Dorothy Jane Scott. In April 1984, the calls suddenly stopped just as they had suddenly started. In August 1984, 4 years after Dorothy Scott disappeared, a construction worker discovered dog remains at Santa Ana Canyon Road, approximately 13 miles away from the UC Irvine Medical Hospital. When the worker continued digging, he unearthed another set of remains, which turned out to be human remains. Those remains sadly belonged to 32-year-old Dorothy Jane Scott. Along with the remains were her turquoise ring and her wristwatch. Dorothy Scott's wristwatch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29, 1980, only one after her initial disappearance. An autopsy was conducted, but the medical examiner was unable to provide a cause of death due to the state of the remains, but foul play is involved. A week after the bones was identified as 32-year-old Dorothy Scott, her mother, Vera Scott, got 2 more disturbing calls from the unknown male caller. The caller asked Vera, "Is Dorothy home?" During the years, no breaks have been made throughout the case. But there is circumstantial evidence that points to a man named Mike Butler. Butler is the brother of a female associate working alongside Dorothy Scott. According to people that knew them both, claimed that Mike Butler had an unhealthy obsession with Dorothy Jane Scott. Unfortunately, there is hardly any evidence to consider him as a suspect. On April 23, 1994, which is Dorothy Scott's birthday, her father Jacob passed away at 69 years old. 8 years later, in 2002, her mother would also leave this earth. The parents of Dorothy Scott, Jacob and Vera Scott, never received any answers as to who, why, and how their daughter died. Dorothy Scott's son has gone on to live a meaningful life, but he still pursues justice for his mother. Dorothy Jane Scott's abduction and murder remain unsolved. Let's take a pause for the cause, and when we return, our co-host, Miss Callie, will be on the line. Be back in a moment. When there is an ending, There was a beginning. Every victim has a picture to paint. Every true crime has its time and place. Please join our MJ podcast, the series Deep into the Woods, Missing Persons, Unsolved Crimes, and the Does. It's with great regret that MJA announces the retirement of Miss Callie from MJA. Miss Callie's years of service will be greatly missed. In some of our upcoming podcasts, you will hear her name as being the co-host to the show because those episodes were pre-recorded before she retired. We would like to introduce our new co-host, Olivia. Olivia has a college background in science and law. Her and I have been working together for years concerning one certain case. Olivia is an excellent researcher. Olivia also wrote a report concerning our case in Louisiana by looking at the death room photos. By using science, Olivia proved that the death room had been staged. That report ended up getting published by the media in Louisiana and at least in 5 other states. It proves that our victim was murdered. You will enjoy Olivia's input to the cases our podcast will cover. Thank you, and be ready for our upcoming episodes. Welcome back to our MJ podcast, the series Deep into the Woods, Missing Persons, Unsolved Crimes, and the Does. This is episode 18, part 3. Unsolved Abduction and Murder. Joining us on the line is our new co-host, Olivia, who also does research for MJA. How are you tonight, Olivia?
I'm doing well.
And when you first read about this case, what did you think about it?
It was a crime of passion to me. It was somebody that was obviously obsessed with her. I have a feeling it's someone that worked closely with her. I'm curious to know how many employees were in her office.
Okay. And so let's talk about the abduction and murder. Dorothy Scott was last seen on May 28, 1980 at the UC Irvine Medical Center in Anaheim, California. Wouldn't you say before the threatening phone call started that Dorothy Scott didn't have a serious concern in her life but her son?
I agree with that. I'll agree with that. She was a responsible individual. She made sure her son was well taken care of.
And wouldn't you say that Dorothy had a good support system in place to help with her son?
Yes.
And it's been reported that Dorothy Scott dated off and on, but her devotion to her son shined through on those dates. Do you think men found that odd because, after all, it was 1980 in California?
I don't know. That's hard to answer because, there are people that do get into relationships with someone that has a child from another relationship. Some people are better equipped to handle that. Some aren't. I can understand how some people wouldn't understand it. But I don't know what it was like in the 80s in California because I'm on the opposite coast, but I would agree some men maybe didn't agree with it because some people want all the attention brought to them.
Okay. And since the 32-year-old Scott didn't care for outdoor activities or social gatherings and would rather stay at home or attend church, why do you think she went on these dates?
It's nice to have companionship. Maybe she was thinking in the future to meet someone that would help her take care of her son.
Okay. Scott's family and friends and colleagues claimed Dorothy was very religious and a compassionate woman. She treated other people with generosity and in all sense and purposes, not giving anyone a reason to dislike her. So why do you think she was targeted?
This obviously is a sick individual that did this to her. I think he was obsessed with her, and you really, I couldn't explain how a mind works with a person that's obsessed, but they were just had this sick obsession with her, and they maybe didn't like the fact that there was a child involved. They wanted her to hurt himself.
Okay. And folks, this is a cruel, sick animal who is way beyond a monster who tortured Dorothy Scott and her parents for years. The unidentified male caller was way beyond the Zodiac killer and the BTK killer. I cannot think of any other case where an unknown caller placed calls for 4 years to the same family. I do not think of anyone who placed calls of this nature that didn't get caught. In my way of thinking, this perpetrator has total impulse control and total discipline to be able to cut the calls so short they couldn't be traced. I cannot think of any other case where the calls started with the victim, and when the victim was dead, the calls carried on to the victim's parents. Olivia, why do you think the perpetrator started stalking Dorothy Scott?
Like I said before, he just had some kind of sick obsession with her. You don't know what these people are thinking. They're sick. It may have been a date that went wrong, and it ticked him off, so he figured he was going to do her harm.
And do you think Dorothy could have met this man at church or at work?
I'm leaning towards work or Southern Church.
And do you think maybe the perp might be someone she dated?
Yes.
And Olivia, what do you think it was important to the perp that Scott knew for a fact that he was stalking her?
These type of people seem to enjoy putting fear into people.
And what do you think the perp wanted to show Scott that he was in complete control, including having control for her life?
That I can't really answer. He just seemed like a controlling person with an obsession, and he wanted to know that he can control her.
Yeah, like it states here, it says 1 minute the unknown caller would be telling Scott how much he loved her, and then the next call he would go into detail how he was going to kill her. What does that say for someone who has been calm enough not to get caught but does fly off the handle?
He's just sick. He's sick. He's not playing with a full deck. I don't
And
know why you would want to threaten someone like that. I don't know. I don't understand why he would constantly be calling her. But he knew enough not to stay in the line long enough, like you said,
yeah,
for the call not to get traced.
right.
He just wanted to put fear into her.
Well, that's my next thing. And to instill more fear into Dorothy Scott, do you think he threatened to cut her up while she was alive to instill that fear?
God knows what he would have said. A person thinking that he could have.
And wouldn't you think, since the perp knew her day-to-day activities on any given day, that Scott would have noticed someone watching or following her?
I would be constantly looking over my shoulder personally if I was getting calls like this. So she had a. Sometimes you get that sixth sense where you could feel someone is watching you. I'm sure she knew somebody was watching her because he seemed to know her whereabouts.
Oh yeah, he even told her what she was wearing that day, where she visited, and yeah, it was.
He could have been sitting outside her house, too.
Yeah, and the phone calls and the stalking tells a story that this perpetrator has probably done this before, but maybe changed his MO to include the phone calls. So where would you start to try to connect some other cases to this perpetrator? Are you there?
You're saying the phone calls may have been different. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying maybe he just changed the MO to include the phone calls.
Yes.
So, do you think there's a possibility that he's treated a woman like this before?
Yes, definitely. He knows how to do this.
Okay.
He's done this before.
And we know the 32-year-old Dorothy Scott disappeared while being with coworkers at the medical center at 11 p.m. on May 28, 1980. When Scott's coworkers seen her vehicle speed out of the parking lot, do you think Scott was driving?
No, I think he was in her car. I think he somehow got in her car, and he was driving.
And we have to consider the perp's past behavior. Do you think he took a big risk to show up at the medical center?
No, there's usually a lot of activity at a hospital. I'm sure he wasn't in plain sight. I would question whether there were cameras in that parking lot to see if anyone got into her car.
In 1980, there probably wasn't too much video cameras
at
that time.
Right.
Yeah. And Olivia, with Scott's vehicle being found on fire, do you think that was to get rid of evidence that someone else was driving?
Sure. Yeah, without a doubt.
There has been circumstantial evidence that points to a man named Mike Butler. Butler is a brother of a female associate working alongside Dorothy Scott. Doesn't that sound to you that would be too easy to lead to the path to Mike Butler?
Yes, it's not usually the obvious. It's usually someone else. That's too obvious.
Yeah, and wouldn't you think that Scott would know Butler's voice since she had known?
Yes, without a doubt. Yeah, I think it's somebody. I had said originally work, but I think it's somebody possibly that works in that office that she doesn't have any interaction with, really. I'll let you. I'm going ahead of myself, so I'll let you keep going.
Okay.
I'm getting ahead of myself.
And to me, the haunting phone calls for years by the perpetrator has many traits to follow. So, how would you explain it? If you're just an average person and you started getting phone calls like that, how would you explain it to somebody?
Nowadays, you can tape people easily. So if we go back in the 80s, I don't think we had phones like we do now. But I would definitely find a way to tape it.
Okay.
Because I know there's profilers that can pick up on things by voice.
Yeah, that's correct.
And if he's done this before, somebody might recognize the voice. You never know.
Okay. And is there anything you would like to add?
No, just like I said, definitely feel it's somebody that was in the office with her. He just got a sick obsession with her. And they may have, or it could have even been, I could be totally wrong, it could be somebody that she went on a date with, and he maybe tried something, and she turned him down, and he just flew off the handle. You don't know who these people are. You really don't know. That's why I don't trust dating sites or anything, and if you do go to a dating site, meet the person in a public place. A lot of people go to, dark areas. I would suggest going to a diner and meeting this person. This way you get to know them a little better. But back then, she was just going on dates. You don't know what happened. There could have been people that she spoke to about it. I don't know. But it's basically all I have to add right now.
Okay. And I want to thank Olivia for being on the show tonight. And I'd also like to thank our viewers and listeners for tuning in, for you all have been so kind. I have a quote for you all. Books have a unique way of stopping time in a particular moment and saying, let's not forget this. David Eggers. Always remember, folks, if you ever get bored with nothing to do, well, take a walk deep into the woods. You might be surprised at what you might find. That's the end of our MJA podcast, the series, Deep into the Woods. This has been episode 18, part 3, an Unsolved Abduction and Murder. My name is Mark, and I was your host for tonight's show, and joining me was our new co-host, Olivia, and we say to all of you, good night from Plattsburgh, New York.
Floating ghost light through the atmosphere, like spirit.